So today we're going to start a short series on Methodism. A lot of you come from backgrounds that are not United Methodist, and a lot of you come from backgrounds that are United Methodist, but you don't know the history of our church. So today's sermon is really a history lesson. The rest of them will be sermons, I promise. So if you like history, then this should appeal to you today. If you don't, if you're like me and weren't ever a fan of history, this might be a little boring, and I apologize in advance. So if you want to understand the history of the United Methodist Church, you have to go back to 18th century England to the spiritual journeys of John Wesley and his brother Charles. Their roots were in the Church of England, as were many of the men and women who followed them. And the first Methodists, as they were dubbed, understood themselves to be a part of the Church of England. In fact, John and Charles never left and were still priests in the Church of England at the time of their deaths. John Wesley, our founder, was born in 1703 to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. He was the 15th of 19 children. Can you imagine? No, I know, right? I have one. Charles was born in 1707. Their father, Samuel, was an Oxford-educated priest in the Church of England who served the rural parish of Epworth for 40 years. Susanna, their mother, one of the youngest of 25 children, again, really, grew up in a clergy family that placed a high premium on personal holiness. Thanks to her own father, she was highly educated, which was very unusual for women in that day, and was in essence the spiritual leader of her family, and in some ways the de facto spiritual leader of the parish to which Samuel was appointed priest. Susanna was a well-respected teacher of the Bible and of spiritual disciplines, not only within her family, but in the larger community as well. It was these Bible studies taught in her kitchen that helped John understand that women, like men, are gifted for spiritual leadership, even though they were not at the time allowed to hold most official church offices. In the early days of the Methodist movement, when John was questioning the role of women as leaders in the growing movement, it was his mother, Susanna, who reminded John that she had provided the primary spiritual leadership in his father's parish during one of his extended absences. So he had a role model for women being able to lead. As Andy Langford writes, through her influence, women increasingly played a crucial role as class leaders and preachers in the Methodist movement. Barbara Heck, called the mother of the Methodist movement in the New World in America, helped establish the first Methodist class in New York. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's go back to John and Charles's days at Oxford, which is where this Methodist movement actually began. As a young man in 1720, John enrolled at Christ.Church College at Oxford University, and it was there in 1725 that John had his so-called Oxford conversion. Following that conversion experience, John was no longer content to be a nominal Christian. So he devoted his whole life to the pursuit of holiness, with a resulting resolve to be more strict in his devotion and more disciplined in his daily life. It was also the year he was ordained a deacon in the Church of England. The following year, 1726, John left Oxford for a brief stint as a parish priest. While he was away, his brother Charles, also a student at Oxford, experienced his own conversion experience and vowed to become more serious about his religious convictions. As a result, he formed what came to be called the Holy Club, a club dedicated to the studies of the earliest Christian writers. In 1729, John returned to Oxford and assumed the leadership of the Holy Club, leading its members to a whole new level of commitment. These people were seriously committed. Under his leadership, the members of the club became more fanatical in their efforts to lead Christ-like lives. And it was their attempts to methodically serve God every hour of every day that led their fellow students to derisively dub them the Methodists. So there you go. That's how we became the Methodists, right? Each day they would arise long before dawn for an hour of prayer, followed by an hour of examining their spiritual lives and an hour of studying the Bible. Then each evening they would gather in one of the members' rooms to study and discuss the Greek New Testament and the classics. In addition to all of this, they found time each week to receive Holy Communion, to take food to the poor, to visit those who were sick or in prison, and to teach orphans how to read. Oh, and on Wednesdays and Fridays, they fasted until 3 p.m. This systematic attempt at total discipline led their critics to say, by rule they eat, by rule they drink, by rule they do all things but think. Accused the priest of loose behavior to get more in the layman's favor. Method alone must guide them all, when themselves Methodists they call. So actually Methodist was really a derisive term, but it became who we were, right? Just a guess, I'm thinking they took more than seriously that passage that Dwight read from 1 Peter. In 1735, Samuel, their father, died, and later that year, John announced that he would be leaving Oxford to take a position in Governor Oglethorpe's new colony in Georgia in America. On October the 4th, 1735, John and Charles set sail for the New World. It was on this voyage that the Wesley brothers first encountered a group of Moravian settlers headed to America. And the deep faith and spirituality of those Moravians had a profound and lasting impact on John. At one point on the voyage, their ship was beset by a fierce storm. The storm was so intense that it broke off the ship's mast. And while the English on board panicked, the Moravians calmly sang hymns and prayed. Witnessing this, John came to believe that the Moravians possessed an inner strength that he was lacking, and their deeply personal religion would prove to be a tremendous influence on John Wesley and his still developing theology. In 1736, John and Charles arrived in Savannah thinking they were to preach to and convert the Native Americans. Instead, John was appointed pastor of the fledgling community at Fort Frederica near Savannah, a task that proved more difficult than he could ever have imagined. He tried to form these settlers there, many of whom had never been to church, into a holy club of sorts. But these pilgrims were more concerned with survival than they were with holy living. To say that things didn't go well, it's putting it mildly. He was literally ran out of town. Again, as Andy Langford puts it, the brothers were spectacularly unsuccessful in their efforts and quickly returned to England, both unsure of their faith and their future. Back in England, defeated and depressed, John and his brother Charles turned to the Moravians they'd encountered on their journey and sought out the counsel of Moravian missionary Peter Bowler, who convinced John that he was working with an inadequate understanding of faith. The Moravians believe that you can't believe what you don't understand, and they believe that faith is a sure trust and confidence in one's salvation and a constant sense of peace and forgiveness. On March 21st, 1738, at a Moravian meeting on Aldersgate Street in London, during a reading of Luther's preface to the Romans, Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed and came to believe that God loved even him. This Aldersgate conversion had a profound effect on Wesley's understanding of God's grace, free in all and free for all. Just a few weeks later, there was a split in the Moravian community over how faith is achieved, with Wesley leaving with the dissenting group and the founding of the First Methodist Society. All these experiences, his upbringing in the Anglican Church, the formation of the Holy Club, his failed mission in Georgia, and his time with the Moravians influenced Wesley's understanding of God's grace and the role of human response in the process of salvation. The result was his belief in via media, the middle way in matters of theology. While he was attracted to the Moravians' emphasis on the primacy of God's grace, he was also a bit troubled by it. The result was a belief that the pathway to salvation lay somewhere between the works theology of the Catholics and the Moravian assertion of grace alone. Drawing on his own Anglican tradition, Wesley unique theology grew out of the tension between his own highly disciplined life and the primacy of grace espoused by the Moravians. For Wesley, the way of salvation was one that maintained a proper relationship between grace, faith, and good works. For him, it wasn't either or, but both and. His was a balanced understanding of faith that held in tension the primacy of God's grace working in us and our response to that grace. It is God's grace that even makes possible our response of faith and works, of piety or good works. Hear that. It is God's grace working in us that even makes possible our response. But that's a topic for next week's sermon. For now, let's focus on the growth of the movement itself and the revival it sparked in England. A revival that would eventually take root in the New World and lead to the formation of an entirely new denomination, the Methodist Episcopal Church in America, one of the predecessor bodies of what we now know as the United Methodist Church. For the next 53 years, John shared his revived faith with anyone who would listen. He spoke at Oxford Chapel, in rural congregations, and in living rooms. Early on, his friend George Whitefield invited him to preach outdoors to coal miners and factory workers. Soon John was preaching in barns, abandoned factories, fields, and even atop his father's tomb. Thousands came to hear him preach, and the results were both immediate and enormous. True revival had begun in England, and many in the established church were none too happy about it. Again, turning to the words of Langford, they felt threatened by the Wesleyan revival and John's call to personal and social holiness. Preaching outdoors, dynamic hymn singing, celebrating Holy Communion among the masses, and challenging the reigning religious ethos of the 18th century England created great controversy. As the revival grew, many pastors refused to let John preach in their churches, and the crowds were often hostile when he preached outside. Yet, this God movement grew. With tens of thousands of followers, the movement gained credibility and became the major movement of 18th century England. A few final notes for today. Singing became a key component of the Methodist revival. John's brother Charles was a brilliant and prolific poet, writing almost 9,000 religious poems, which he often set to popular and easily sung tunes. Many Christians learned the faith through these hymns, one of which we'll sing in a minute. John Wesley was a brilliant and seemingly tireless organizer. He urged people who were wanting to grow in their faith to join weekly classes or societies in order to continue their faith development. He established thousands of these classes around the country and recruited and trained lay preachers to oversee them. He also believed that true commitment to Christ included a commitment to serving others. He established an orphanage, Sunday schools, which were literally school on Sundays for people who couldn't afford to go to school, a free medical clinic, a credit union, food pantries, and clothes closets. He also empowered women as leaders and encouraged all his followers to discover their own leadership abilities and to put those to work in the communities in which they lived. In his lifetime, John Wesley traveled over 250,000 miles by horseback and preached over 40,000 sermons. When he died at the age of 87, he left behind over 500 preachers, almost 80,000 Methodists in England, 57,000 in the United States, and clusters of Methodists in dozens of other countries. By the end of his life, Methodism had become a respected segment of English society and an entirely new denomination in the United States, one that would play a significant role in shaping the religious landscape of the fledgling country. But again, that's a topic for another day. So that's your history in a nutshell of Methodism. Next week, we'll talk more about theology and how his theology shaped who we are today. Thank you for listening.